So today we are going to learn about the central nervous system. These are the intended learning outcomes of this lecture. So at the end of this lecture, you should be able to list the components of the brain and describe the gross anatomy of the cerebrum, identify the main sensory and motor areas of the cerebrum, describe the structure and the functions of the cerebellum, and describe the blood supply to the brain. The central nervous system consists of brain and the spinal cord. As we know, brain is located within the skull, and the spinal cord is located within the vertebral canal, which is formed by the vertebrae. Both brain and the spinal cord are completely surrounded by three membranes called the meninges. The central nervous system develops from the embryonic neural tube. The neural tube becomes the brain and the spinal cord, while the opening of the neural tube becomes the chambers within the brain and the spinal cord. You can see the development in this picture. Now we are going to learn about different regions of the brain. The brain is composed of cerebral hemispheres, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. You can see these different regions are in different colors in this image. These are the three main functional divisions of the brain. The cerebrum, which is in purple color, the cerebellum, which is in green color, and the brainstem, which is in orange color. In another way, the components of the brain also can be divided into three main regions called forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So you can see the components of each region in this image. Now we are going to talk about cerebral hemispheres, or we call them cerebrum. The term hemispheres gives us the idea about the shape of the brain. Brain is like a sphere or a ball, but it is composed of two halves of a sphere. So that's why it is called hemispheres, two halves of a ball. So this left and right paired balls form the superior parts of the brain. The cerebrum includes more than half of the total brain mass. The surface of the cerebrum is made up of ridges, what we call gyri, or the singular form gyrus, and grooves, what we call sulci, or the singular form sulcus. And also the cerebrum divides into lobes by deep grooves, which we call fissures. In the midline of the cerebrum, there is a longitudinal cerebral fissure. It separates the two cerebral hemispheres incompletely. That is because at the floor of the cerebral fissure, there is an organ called corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is a large myelinated fiber tract that forms an anatomical and functional connection between the right and left hemispheres. This is a cross-section of the brain. There you can see the longitudinal fissure which separate the right and left cerebral hemispheres, and also the corpus callosum which make the connection between these two hemispheres. When we are considering about the cortex of cerebrum, there is central sulcus, which is located about midway along the length of the brain. It is extend across the lateral surface of the cerebrum from superior to inferior. Anterior to the central sulcus, there is the precentral gyrus. It is the primary motor cortex area of the cerebrum. Posterior to the central sulcus, there is postcentral gyrus, which is the primary somatic sensory cortex area of the cerebrum. In this image, you can see the central sulcus as well as the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. The temporal lobe of the cerebrum is separated from the rest of the cerebrum by a fissure called lateral fissure. The area deep within the fissure is called insula. The insula is referred to as the fifth lobe of the cerebrum. Parieto-occipital sulcus is a groove on medial surface of each hemisphere. It separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. In this image, you can see the central sulcus, the lateral fissure, and parieto-occipital sulcus. In this image, you can see the location of insula, which is referred to as the fifth lobe of the cerebrum, underneath the lateral fissure. So now we are going to learn about the lobes of the cerebrum. In the surface of the cerebrum, there are four main lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So you can see them in different colors in the picture. Go through this image carefully and you can find the location of different lobes and also major gyri and fissures of the cerebral hemispheres. The gray matter which lies on the outer surface of the cerebrum is called cerebral cortex. The clusters of gray matter which lies deep inside the brain are called nuclei. The thickness of the cortex is not uniform throughout the cerebrum. The white matter of the brain, which lies between the cortex and the nuclei, is called cerebral medulla. These images will give you the idea how this gray matter and white matter arrange in the brain. So you can see the outer cortex and the inner medulla as well as the basal ganglia, which are the nuclei of the brain. When we are considering about the functional area of the cerebrum, there are two main areas. The first one is somatic sensory area. It lies on the post-central gyrus, just behind the central sulcus. And the second one is primary motor area, which lies on pre-central gyrus, that is just in front of the central sulcus. The somatic sensory area receives impulses from the body's sensory receptors, while the primary motor area sends impulses to the skeletal muscles. What is brainstem? It is the organ which attaches brain to the spinal cord. It consists of three parts: the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So you can see all these parts of the brainstem in this image. Now we are going to talk about the cerebellum. It is attached to brainstem posterior to the pons. The cerebellum has a gray cortex and also nuclei with white medulla in between them. When we are considering about the gross anatomy of cerebellum, the cerebellar cortex has ridges called folia, and the white matter of the medulla resembles a branching tree, therefore it is called arbor vitae. So you can see the folia as well as arbor vitae in the image below. Let's see about the function of cerebellum. The cerebellum receives information from the sensory systems, the spinal cord, and also from the other parts of the brain, and then regulate motor movements. The cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements such as posture, balance, coordination, and speech, which result in smooth and balanced muscular activity. So this is the end of the first part of this lecture.